The October sun painted the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, Texas, with golden hues that contrasted sharply with the melancholy hanging over the small town of just 2,800 residents. Dry leaves danced across the cracked asphalt of Main Street, passing by storefronts with "For Lease" signs that had been there so long they'd faded to pale whispers of their former selves. Cedar Ridge had once thrived on cattle ranching and oil, but those days were memories now, tucked away like old photographs in dusty albums. The younger generation had long since migrated to Dallas or Austin, chasing opportunities that their hometown could no longer provide. What remained was a community of weathered faces, calloused hands, and hearts that still beat with the stubborn rhythm of small-town pride. At the heart of Main Street stood the Starlight Cinema, a single-screen theater that had been the cultural beacon of Cedar Ridge for over 60 years. Its Art Deco facade, though worn by decades of Texas sun and winter storms, still retained an elegant dignity. The marquee, with several letters missing or hanging askew, currently displayed "Closing Soon, Thank You Cedar Ridge" in stark black letters against the white background. Inside the theater, Margaret Morrison wiped tears from her eyes as she counted the meager proceeds from the previous night's showing. At 62, she had spent most of her adult life managing the Starlight alongside her husband Robert, who had passed away 3 years ago from cancer. Their son David, now 38, worked as the projectionist and maintenance man, but his shoulders sagged under the weight of watching his family's legacy crumble. "Mom, we got the final notice from the bank today," David said quietly, entering the office with an envelope in his hand. His voice carried the heavy resignation of someone who had fought hard, but knew the battle was lost. "They're giving us 30 days. After that, Henderson Development is taking over." Margaret looked up from the ledger book, her gray hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for decades. The numbers on the page blurred through her tears. "Henderson wants to tear it down and build a parking lot for their new strip mall," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David sat down in the worn leather chair across from his mother's desk, the same chair where his father used to sit every morning, planning which films to order, which community events to host, and how to keep their little piece of cinema magic alive. Maybe Dad would understand. Maybe he'd want us to let it go. "Your father built this place with his own hands," Margaret replied, gesturing toward the theater beyond the office walls. "He painted every wall, installed every seat, and believed that this community deserved something beautiful, something that would bring people together." She paused, looking at a framed photograph on her desk, showing Robert at the theater's grand opening in 1963, "But I don't know how to keep his dream alive anymore." The Starlight had been more than just a movie theater to Cedar Ridge. It was where teenagers had their first dates, where families gathered for Saturday matinees, where the community came together during difficult times. Robert Morrison had made sure of that, hosting special screenings for local fundraisers, offering free tickets to families struggling financially, and creating a space where everyone felt welcome. But streaming services, economic hardship, and the general decline of small-town life had slowly eroded their audience. What used to be packed Friday night showings now drew maybe 20 or 30 people. The cost of upgrading to digital projection equipment had nearly bankrupted them, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't compete with the multiplex 30 miles away in the county seat. Outside, the late afternoon wind carried the scent of mesquite and distant rain. Cedar Ridge's Main Street looked like a scene from a Western film, complete with hitching posts that were now mostly decorative and buildings that had witnessed the rise and fall of the American frontier spirit. The town had a timeless quality, as if it existed in a pocket where progress moved at its own deliberate pace. Sarah Chen, the 34-year-old editor of the Cedar Ridge Gazette, walked into the Starlight's lobby carrying her camera and notepad. As one of the few young professionals who had chosen to stay in town, she felt a personal responsibility to document its stories before they disappeared forever. She had been covering the theater's financial struggles for months, hoping that public attention might somehow save it. "Mrs. Morrison!" Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the empty lobby. The space still smelled of butter popcorn and old velvet, a comforting mixture that instantly transported visitors back to simpler times. "I'm here for the interview about the closing. I know this is difficult, but people need to know what we're losing." Margaret emerged from the office, smoothing her apron and attempting a smile. Despite the circumstances, she maintained the gracious demeanor that had made her a beloved figure in the community. "Of course, dear, though I'm not sure what else there is to say. We've tried everything." They settled into the theater's front row, surrounded by the red velvet seats that Robert had insisted on when others suggested cheaper alternatives. Each seat told a story: couples who had shared first kisses, children who had experienced movie magic for the first time, elderly residents who had found companionship in the darkness when loneliness threatened to overwhelm them. "Tell me what this place has meant to Cedar Ridge," Sarah said, her digital recorder capturing every word. As a newcomer to town, having moved from California 5 years ago, she was still discovering the deep roots and interconnected stories that defined small-town life. Margaret's eyes grew distant as she looked toward the screen. "This theater has been witness to 60 years of our lives. Births, deaths, celebrations, heartbreaks. Your neighbor Mrs. Patterson met her late husband at a screening of The Sound of Music. The Williamson twins had their birthday parties here every year. When the high school burned down in '85, we hosted the graduation ceremony on this stage." David joined them from the projection booth, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. He had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude, but lacked the business acumen needed to navigate the theater through modern challenges. "People don't understand that when you lose a place like this, you lose more than just entertainment. You lose a gathering place, a shared experience, something that brings the community together." Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper implications. She had seen how the loss of communal spaces had affected other small towns, leaving residents increasingly isolated and disconnected from each other. "Have you considered starting a crowdfunding campaign? Maybe reaching out to former residents who have moved away?" "We've tried everything," Margaret replied. "Fundraisers, grants, even reached out to some film preservation societies. But we need $40,000 just to catch up on what we owe, and that doesn't include the ongoing operational costs. Even if we raised that money, we'd probably be back in the same situation within a year." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. Through the theater's large windows, they could see a small convoy of trucks and cars arriving. This was unusual for Cedar Ridge, where traffic was typically limited to local residents and the occasional lost traveler. Tom Bradley, the town's sheriff and Margaret's longtime friend, entered the lobby with a puzzled expression on his weathered face. At 55, Tom had seen everything that small-town life could offer, but the scene outside had him scratching his head. "Margaret, you might want to come see this," he said. "There's some kind of entourage setting up outside. Looks like they might be musicians or something. They're asking about using your theater for some kind of event." Through the window, they could see several crew members unloading sound equipment and instruments. A tall, thin man with long braided hair and a distinctive red bandana was directing the operation. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about his silhouette. "Oh my lord," Margaret whispered, her hand flying to her chest. "That's Willie Nelson." The arrival of the country music legend sent a ripple of excitement through the small group. Cedar Ridge rarely attracted visitors of any note, let alone someone of Willie's caliber. Sarah immediately began taking photographs, her journalistic instincts kicking into high gear. Willie Nelson approached the theater entrance with the easy, unhurried gait that had characterized his entire career. At 90 years old, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen it all, but remained curious about what came next. His manager, an efficient-looking woman named Linda Patterson, walked beside him carrying a clipboard and phone. "Afternoon, folks," Willie said, his distinctive voice immediately recognizable even in casual conversation. "I'm Willie Nelson, and I understand this theater might be available for a little impromptu concert tonight. We're traveling through and heard this was a special place." Margaret struggled to find words, still processing the surreal nature of the situation. David stepped forward to shake Willie's hand, his usual shyness overcome by excitement. "Mr. Nelson, sir, it's an incredible honor. I grew up listening to your music, but I'm afraid we're closing down. Tonight was supposed to be our last showing." Willie's expression grew thoughtful as he looked around the lobby, taking in the vintage movie posters, the antique concession stand, and the unmistakable atmosphere of a place that had been loved and cared for across many decades. Closing down? That'd be a real shame. A place like this has soul. You can feel it the moment you walk in. Linda Patterson, who had been making notes and phone calls, joined the conversation. "We were hoping to book a venue for tonight's performance. Willie likes to play in intimate settings when he can, and we heard about your theater from someone in town." "Who told you about us?" Margaret asked, curious about how word of their little theater had reached such a prominent figure. Willie's expression became more serious, and he seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "An old friend of mine used to talk about this place. Said it was where magic happened. He passed away a few years back, but he made me promise to visit if I ever came through Cedar Ridge." The mention of a deceased friend cast a somber mood over the group, but there was something in Willie's tone that suggested there was more to the story. Sarah sensed that she was witnessing the beginning of something significant, though she couldn't yet understand what. "Well, we'd be honored to host your concert," Margaret said, her practical nature taking over. "Though I should warn you, we don't have the most sophisticated sound system, and our audience might be smaller than you're used to." Willie smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening with genuine warmth. "Ma'am, I've played in honky-tonks, barns, and parking lots. What matters isn't the size of the crowd, it's the size of their hearts. And I have a feeling Cedar Ridge has plenty of heart." As word spread through the small town that Willie Nelson would be performing at the Starlight Cinema, the energy in Cedar Ridge shifted dramatically. Phone calls were made, text messages sent, and social media posts shared. For the first time in months, there was genuine excitement in the air. But as Willie walked through the theater, examining the architecture and absorbing the atmosphere, he seemed to be looking for something specific. His eyes lingered on certain details: the hand-painted murals on the walls, the original brass fixtures, the way the afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows in the lobby. "This friend of yours," Margaret said quietly. "What was his name?" Willie paused in his examination of the theater, his hand resting on the back of one of the vintage seats. "Johnny Thompson. He was a musician, like me. We traveled together for a while in the 60s. He used to tell me about a girl he met at a movie theater in Texas. Said that one night changed his whole life." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Johnny Thompson had indeed been a regular at the Starlight in the early days, but he was much more than just another customer. He had been part of the theater's history in a way that even she had nearly forgotten. The name Johnny Thompson hung in the air like a musical note that wouldn't fade. Margaret sank into one of the lobby chairs, her legs suddenly unsteady. The memories came flooding back with startling clarity. A young man with kind eyes and calloused fingers who used to sit in the back row every Friday night, not really watching the movies, but writing songs in a notebook by the light of the screen. Johnny Thompson, she repeated softly. I haven't heard that name in, it must be 25 years. Willie's attention sharpened, and he moved closer to Margaret. You knew Johnny? Knew him. He practically lived here for 2 years, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. This was in the late 60s, early 70s. He was trying to make it as a songwriter, playing small venues around Texas. But every Friday night, he'd be here in seat J7, scribbling in that leather notebook of his. David looked confused, having never heard this story before. Sarah continued taking notes, sensing that they were uncovering something important. Tom Bradley, who had lived in Cedar Ridge his entire life, nodded slowly as the memories returned to him as well. He was sweet on Betty Walsh, Tom said suddenly. I remember now. Betty worked at the pharmacy then. Pretty girl with auburn hair and a laugh that could light up a room. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Betty Walsh, who became Betty Thompson after Johnny finally worked up the courage to ask her to marry him. Right here in this theater, during the intermission of Bonnie and Clyde. I was working the concession stand that night. I'll never forget it. Willie sat down heavily in the chair next to Margaret, his usual composed demeanor giving way to visible emotion. Johnny married Betty in 1971. He wrote me a letter about it, said he'd found his muse and his soulmate in the same person. They had a daughter, Marie Thompson, Margaret whispered. She used to come to the Saturday matinees with her parents. Such a bright little girl, always asking questions about how the projector worked, why the screen was curved, whether the actors could see the audience. The pieces of the story were falling into place, but there was still something Willie wasn't sharing. Sarah could see it in his expression, the way he kept glancing toward the theater itself, as if he was looking for confirmation of something he already knew. Linda Patterson had been quietly making phone calls outside, but she now rejoined the group with an expression of concern. Willie, we need to talk about tonight's logistics. The venue in Austin called, and they're willing to add an extra night to accommodate the fans who will be disappointed if we cancel. But Willie wasn't listening. He was studying a display case near the concession stand that contained memorabilia from the theater's history. Old movie stills, newspaper clippings, and photographs from special events. His finger traced the glass as he examined a particular photo. That's from our 25th anniversary celebration in 1988, Margaret said, following his gaze. Robert insisted on documenting everything. He said the theater was like a family album, and every event was worth preserving. Willie pointed to a photograph showing a small concert on the theater's stage. A young woman with a guitar was performing for an audience of about 50 people. Tell me about this picture. Margaret leaned in to look more closely. Oh, that's Marie Thompson, Johnny and Betty's daughter. She was maybe 18 then, just out of high school. She wanted to follow in her father's footsteps and become a musician. We let her perform here a few times, trying to help her get started. Marie was incredibly talented, David added, the memory surfacing from his teenage years. She wrote her own songs, had this amazing voice. I had a crush on her, actually. Most of the boys in town did. Willie's hands were trembling slightly as he continued to study the photograph. What happened to her? The question hung in the air, and Margaret's expression grew sad. Life happened. Betty got sick, cancer, and Marie had to take care of her mother. Johnny was on the road more and more, trying to make enough money to pay for treatments. Marie gave up her music to work at the hospital in the county seat. She was so devoted to her mother. Tom Bradley nodded grimly. Betty fought for 3 years. Marie never left her side. Johnny would come home between tours, but he was struggling too. The music business wasn't kind to him. He never quite broke through like he hoped. After Betty died, Marie moved away, Margaret continued. She said there were too many memories here. Johnny kept touring, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. We'd get Christmas cards for a few years, then nothing. Willie closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. Marie died 2 years ago. Breast cancer, like her mother. She was living in California, working as a music therapist at a children's hospital. Johnny never got over losing her. The revelation struck the group like a thunderbolt. The connection between Willie Nelson and their little theater was deeper and more tragic than anyone had imagined. Sarah stopped taking notes, overwhelmed by the weight of the story she was witnessing. Johnny passed 6 months after Marie. Willie continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't live with the grief. But before he died, he gave me something. Said it was the most important thing he owned. And he wanted me to understand why this place mattered so much to him. Willie reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather notebook. The same one Margaret had described, the one Johnny used to write in during those Friday night movies. He made me promise that if I ever came through Cedar Ridge, I'd visit the Starlight. He said it was where he learned what love really meant. Margaret reached for the notebook with shaking hands. May I? Willie nodded, and she opened it carefully. The pages were filled with song lyrics, musical notations, and personal observations written in Johnny's distinctive handwriting. But it was the dedication on the first page that made her gasp. For Betty, who taught me that every story needs a perfect setting, and the Starlight Cinema, where our story began. As Margaret flipped through the pages, she found songs that clearly referenced the theater, their town, and the early days of Johnny and Betty's relationship. One song, titled Starlight Serenade, described in detail the night Johnny proposed, complete with references to the specific movie they were watching and the way the lobby lights reflected off Betty's engagement ring. He wrote about us, Margaret said wonderingly. About the theater, the town, the people. We were part of his music. Willie nodded. Johnny always said that the best songs come from real places and real people. He never forgot where he came from, even when life took him far away from here. David was studying one of the notebook's pages over his mother's shoulder. This song here, Small Town Saturday Night, it mentions the Starlight by name. And here, the girl in row 5. That must be about Mom when she was young and working the concession stand. The realization that their theater had been immortalized in song, even in obscure compositions that never found their way to commercial success, gave the building's impending closure an even more profound sense of loss. Linda Patterson, who had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement, spoke up. Willie, this is incredible, but we still need to make a decision about tonight. The crew is waiting, and people are starting to gather outside. Indeed, word of Willie Nelson's impromptu concert had spread throughout Cedar Ridge and beyond. Cars were arriving from neighboring towns, and a crowd was forming on Main Street. For many residents, this would be their first and last chance to see a living legend perform in their hometown. But Willie seemed lost in thought, still processing the emotional weight of returning Johnny's notebook to the place where so many of the songs were born. Margaret, what would it take to keep this theater open? The question was so unexpected that Margaret didn't know how to respond. Mr. Nelson, that's very kind of you to ask, but it would take a miracle at this point. We owe $40,000 to various creditors, and that's just to avoid losing the building. We'd need ongoing support to actually operate again. Willie stood up and walked to the theater's main entrance, looking out at the growing crowd. People were setting up lawn chairs and blankets on the sidewalk, creating an impromptu festival atmosphere. Children were running between the adults, and local vendors had appeared with coolers of soft drinks and homemade snacks. Johnny made me promise something else, Willie said. turning back to face the group. He said that if the Starlight ever needed help, I should do whatever I could. He believed that places like this are what keep communities alive. Sarah sensed that they were approaching the climax of Willie's visit, though she couldn't predict what form it would take. "Mr. Nelson, what are you thinking?" Willie smiled, but it was the kind of smile that suggested big decisions were being made. "I'm thinking that tonight might be more than just a concert. I'm thinking it might be the start of something bigger." Outside, the crowd continued to grow as the sun began to set. The warm Texas evening was perfect for an outdoor gathering, and there was an electricity in the air that Cedar Ridge hadn't felt in years. Local news crews from neighboring cities had arrived, alerted by social media posts about Willie Nelson's surprise appearance. But inside the Starlight Cinema, a more intimate drama was unfolding. The convergence of past and present, music and memory, loss and hope, was creating something that none of them had expected when the day began. Margaret looked around at the theater that had been her life's work, imagining it filled with music instead of movies for one magical night. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that Willie's presence here was about more than just honoring an old friend's memory. "There's something else, isn't there?" she asked Willie directly. "Something you haven't told us yet." Willie nodded slowly. "Johnny left me more than just his notebook. He left me his estate, what little there was of it. And he left me with specific instructions about what to do with it." Willie Nelson walked to the center of the Starlight's lobby, his presence somehow making the space feel both larger and more intimate. The dying sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the worn carpet, where 3 generations of Cedar Ridge residents had gathered for entertainment, romance, and community. "Johnny Thompson wasn't just my friend," Willie began, his voice carrying the storyteller's cadence that had made him a legend. "He was one of the most talented songwriters I ever knew. But more than that, he was one of the best men I ever knew." Margaret clutched Johnny's notebook against her chest, as if holding on to the physical manifestation of memories she thought were lost forever. David and Sarah listened intently, while Tom Bradley nodded with the solemn respect that small-town people reserve for stories about their own. In 1972, Johnny wrote a song called "The Theater on Main Street," Willie continued. "It was about this place, about Betty, about the life he wanted to build in Cedar Ridge. I recorded a demo of it, thought it might be something special. But Johnny wouldn't let me release it." Linda Patterson looked up from her phone, where she had been coordinating with the sound crew outside. "Willie, I remember that song. You played it for me years ago. It was beautiful." Willie nodded. "Johnny said the song was too personal, too specific to this place and these people to be shared with the world. He said some songs weren't meant for fame. They were meant for memory." Margaret's eyes widened as she flipped through the notebook, looking for the song Willie mentioned. She found it near the back, written in Johnny's careful script, with musical notations and several crossed-out verses showing how he had labored over every word. "Here it is," she whispered, reading the opening lines aloud. "There's a theater on Main Street where the movies play each night, but the real show is the people in the soft electric light. She sells popcorn by the counter, he runs films on the screen, and their love stories better than any movie scene." David leaned over to read along, his voice joining his mother's for the chorus. "In the theater on Main Street, where the dreams come alive, where a small-town boy met his girl and learned how to thrive. Every seat holds a story. Every show brings us together. In the theater on Main Street, where love lasts forever." The words hung in the air like a benediction, transforming the shabby lobby into something sacred. Even Sarah, who had moved to Cedar Ridge from the anonymous sprawl of Los Angeles, felt the power of belonging that Johnny had captured in his lyrics. Willie pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, yellowed with age and bearing his name in Johnny's distinctive handwriting. This is the letter Johnny left for me. He made his lawyer promise to deliver it only if something happened to Marie, and only if I agreed to carry out his final wishes. With trembling fingers, Willie unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. Dear Willie, if you're reading this, then Betty and Marie are both gone, and I'm probably not far behind. I know that sounds morbid, but I need you to understand something. The Starlight Cinema saved my life, not in some dramatic way, but in the quiet, daily way that real salvation works. I was just another struggling songwriter with big dreams and empty pockets when I first walked into that theater in 1968. But Margaret Morrison treated me like family from day one. She'd let me sit in the back and write songs during the movies, never charging me extra for the lighting, sometimes bringing me coffee during intermission. And Betty, my beautiful Betty. I watched her every Friday night for 6 months before I worked up the courage to ask her out. She worked at the pharmacy and came to the late shows because it was the only time she could relax. I fell in love with her laugh before I ever heard her voice. That theater is where I learned that love isn't just a feeling. It's a place. It's the spot where two people decide to build something together. For Betty and me, that place was row 5, seats 7 and 8, during a showing of The Graduate on October 15, 1968. Willie, I know this sounds sentimental, but that building holds the best parts of who I was. And I know it holds the same kinds of memories for hundreds of other people. Small towns are disappearing, and places like the Starlight are disappearing with them. I'm leaving you everything I have, which isn't much, but it includes the royalties from Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain and Crazy, the 2 songs of mine that you turned into magic. I want you to use that money to save the Starlight if it ever needs saving. Not for me, but for all the Johnny and Betty Thompsons who haven't met yet. Promise me, old friend, promise me that love will have a place to happen in Cedar Ridge. Your grateful friend, Johnny Thompson P.S. There's a loose floorboard under seat J7. I hid something there in 1969 and never had the courage to retrieve it. Maybe it's time. The letter left everyone speechless. The practical implications of what Johnny was asking were staggering, but the emotional weight was even greater. Willie folded the letter carefully and looked around at the faces surrounding him. The royalties Johnny mentioned, Willie said quietly, they've grown considerably over the years. He never touched them, living on what he made from touring and session work. There's enough to save the theater and keep it running for many years to come. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Nelson, that's impossible. We couldn't accept such a gift. It's not from me, Willie replied gently. It's from Johnny. I'm just the messenger. David was staring at seat J7, the same seat where his mother had described Johnny writing songs all those years ago. What do you think he hid under there? Willie shrugged. Only one way to find out. The group moved into the theater proper, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The burgundy velvet seats, though faded and worn, still retained their dignity. Willie made his way to row J, counting seats until he reached the 7th one from the aisle. The seat was identical to all the others, but as Willie examined it more closely, he noticed that it rocked slightly when he pressed on it. Tom Bradley, with his practical sheriff's experience, knelt down and examined the base of the seat. There's definitely a loose board here, Tom confirmed. He worked his fingers around the edges until he could lift a small section of flooring. There's something wrapped in plastic down here. He carefully extracted a small package wrapped in several layers of plastic bags. Johnny's attempt to protect whatever he had hidden from decades of moisture and dust. Inside was a small velvet ring box and another letter, this one addressed to my future wife. Margaret opened the ring box to reveal a simple but beautiful engagement ring. A single diamond on a gold band, modest but clearly chosen with love. The accompanying letter was brief but heartbreaking. To the woman I'm going to marry. I bought this ring with the money from my first published song. I'm hiding it here in the place where I hope to propose to you someday. I don't know who you are yet, but I know you'll love movies and music and maybe even me. When I find the courage to ask you to marry me, we'll come back here together and reclaim this symbol of our future. Love, Johnny Thompson. December 23rd, 1969. He bought the ring almost a year before he proposed to Betty, Margaret whispered. He was so sure this theater would be part of his love story. Willie took the ring box and held it up to the light. Johnny proposed with a different ring. I remember him telling me about it. He saved up for months to buy Betty something more expensive. This ring was his backup plan, his insurance policy against losing his nerve. The discovery added another layer of poignancy to the evening. Here was physical proof of Johnny's faith in the theater as a place where love could flourish. Tangible evidence of dreams that had been realized in ways he never expected. Outside, the crowd was growing restless. The sound crew had finished setting up, and people were asking when the concert would begin. Local television crews were interviewing residents about their memories of the theater and their excitement about Willie's surprise appearance. "We should probably start the show," Linda Patterson said diplomatically. "The crowd is getting pretty large, and we don't want to disappoint people." But Willie was studying the theater with new eyes, seeing it not just as a venue for tonight's performance, but as the repository of countless love stories, dreams, and community memories. "Before we start, I want to make something clear to everyone here." He turned to face Margaret and David directly. "Johnny Thompson left me money to save this theater, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. But I don't want to just pay your debts and walk away. I want to help make sure the Starlight has a future." Margaret was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the generosity and the way the evening had transformed from heartbreak into hope. "Mr. Nelson, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me buy out your debts," Willie replied. "Say you'll accept a partnership that will keep this place running. And say you'll let me honor my friend's memory by making sure his love story has a permanent home." David stepped forward, his usual shyness overcome by emotion. "Sir, my father always said this theater belonged to the community, not just to our family. If you want to help us save it, then we accept. Gratefully." Sarah had been documenting everything, but now she put down her camera and joined the conversation. "This is going to be the most incredible story Cedar Ridge has ever produced. A story about friendship, love, music, and community. People need to know about this." Willie nodded. "But first, we have a concert to play. And I have an idea about how to make tonight even more special." The discovery of Johnny's hidden ring had created an almost sacred atmosphere in the Starlight Cinema. Willie Nelson held the small velvet box in his weathered hands, understanding that he was holding more than just a piece of jewelry. He was holding the physical manifestation of dreams, hopes, and a love story that had shaped 2 lives and rippled through an entire community. Margaret Morrison wiped tears from her eyes as she read Johnny's letter to his future wife once more. He was so young when he wrote this, so full of hope and certainty that love would find him here. David looked around the theater with new eyes, seeing it not just as his family's struggling business, but as a repository of countless personal histories. How many other stories like this are hidden in this building? How many lives were changed by what happened in these seats? Willie stood up slowly, his knees protesting the sudden movement. At 90 years old, he had learned to treasure moments of profound meaning, and this discovery felt like a gift from beyond the grave. "Johnny left me specific instructions about this ring. He wanted me to find it, and he wanted me to understand what this place meant to him before I decided how to help. Sarah Chen had been documenting everything, but now she set down her camera and joined the conversation as a participant rather than an observer. "Mr. Nelson, what were Johnny's specific instructions?" Willie reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope, this one newer and bearing the letterhead of a Nashville law firm. "This came with the letter I read earlier. Johnny's lawyer sent it to me 6 months ago, along with instructions that I was only to open it if I actually came to Cedar Ridge and found the ring." The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with Johnny's handwriting, clearly written in the final months of his life when illness had made his normally steady script shaky and uncertain. "Willie, if you're reading this, then you found my backup ring and you understand how much this theater means to me. But I need you to understand something else. Betty and I weren't the only couple whose love story began at the Starlight. This place has been the setting for dozens of romances, proposals, and first dates over the years. Margaret Morrison told me once that she keeps a scrapbook of all the couples who met at her theater. Wedding announcements, anniversary celebrations, even divorce papers when things don't work out. She said it was her way of honoring the role the Starlight played in people's lives. I want you to ask her to show you that scrapbook. I want you to understand that saving this theater isn't just about preserving my memories. It's about preserving a place where love has flourished for 3 generations. Margaret's eyes widened. The scrapbook. I haven't looked at it in years, but it's in the office safe. Robert started it, actually. He said every theater should keep track of the love stories it helps create. She disappeared into the office and returned a few minutes later, carrying a large, leather-bound scrapbook that was clearly decades old. The pages were thick with newspaper clippings, photographs, wedding invitations, and handwritten notes from couples whose relationships had been touched by the Starlight Cinema. Willie opened the scrapbook to the first page, which contained a newspaper clipping from 1965. Local sweethearts wed after theater romance. The article described the marriage of 2 high school students who had been dating since meeting during a showing of The Sound of Music. As Willie flipped through the pages, a pattern emerged. The Starlight Cinema had been the backdrop for literally hundreds of romantic milestones over the years. There were photographs of couples on their wedding days, anniversary cards sent to the theater from people celebrating decades of marriage, and even thank you notes from children whose parents had met at the movies. One particularly touching entry was a letter dated 1978. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, 20 years ago, I was a shy teenager who came to your theater every Friday night because I had a crush on the girl who worked the concession stand. It took me 6 months to work up the courage to ask her to share a box of popcorn, and another 3 months to ask her on a real date. Last month, we celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary, and we brought our children to see Star Wars at the Starlight. Our oldest son asked why we always hold hands during the movies, and we told him it's because that's how love stories are supposed to work. Thank you for giving us a place where our story could begin. David was reading over Willie's shoulder, amazed by the scope of his family's inadvertent role in the community's romantic history. I had no idea we were keeping track of all this. Dad never told me about the scrapbook. Margaret smiled sadly. Your father was sentimental about a lot of things, but he was also private. He didn't want people to think he was taking credit for their happiness. He said love finds a way no matter what, but maybe having a beautiful place to watch it happen makes the stories a little more special. Willie continued through the scrapbook, finding entries that spanned 5 decades of Cedar Ridge's social history. There were formal wedding announcements from the 1960s, Polaroid snapshots from the 1970s, and digital photographs printed from emails in more recent years. The common thread was always the same: couples crediting the Starlight Cinema with playing a crucial role in their love stories. One of the most recent entries was particularly poignant. It was a handwritten note dated just 2 years earlier. Mrs. Morrison, I wanted to let you know that my husband passed away last month after 53 years of marriage. We had our first date at your theater in 1968, watching Romeo and Juliet, which seemed terribly romantic at the time. Over the years, we came back for anniversaries, brought our children for Saturday matinees, and even celebrated our golden wedding anniversary with a private screening of our wedding film. The Starlight has been part of our family story from the very beginning. I know the theater is struggling financially, and I wish I could help, but I wanted you to know that you've given our community something precious. You've given us a place where love stories can unfold with dignity and beauty. Thank you for 50 years of magic. Satiu. The letter was signed by Eleanor Patterson, a widow Willie had met earlier that day among the growing crowd outside. "This is incredible," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't just a building that shows movies. It's a repository of human connections spanning 3 generations." Willie closed the scrapbook carefully, understanding now the full weight of Johnny Thompson's final request. Saving the Starlight Cinema wasn't just about preserving a business or even honoring a friendship. It was about protecting a place that had served as the catalyst for countless love stories. A venue where community members had shared their most important emotional moments. Outside, the crowd was growing larger and more restless. The sun was setting, and people were expecting the concert to begin soon. But Willie knew that what was about to happen would be much more than a musical performance. It would be a celebration of everything the theater represented to the community. "Before we go out there," Willie said to Margaret and David, "I need you to know something. Johnny's legacy fund is substantial enough to not only save this theater, but to ensure it thrives for decades to come. But I don't want to just pay off debts and walk away. I want to create something that honors what this place has meant to people." Margaret looked confused. "What do you mean?" Willie smiled, the kind of smile that suggested big ideas were taking shape. "I mean, I want to make sure that every person in Cedar Ridge knows that their love stories matter, that their connections to this place are valued and preserved." Tom Bradley poked his head into the theater. "Folks, we've got about 1,000 people out here now, and they're getting pretty excited. The local TV crews are set up, and I think we might want to get started before the crowd gets any bigger." Willie nodded, but he had one more surprise to reveal before the evening's main event could begin. "Margaret, there's something else Johnny asked me to do. He wanted me to make sure that every couple whose love story began at the Starlight got a chance to celebrate that connection." He reached into his guitar case and pulled out a stack of envelopes, each one addressed to a different Cedar Ridge family. "Johnny's lawyer helped me track down contact information for every couple mentioned in that scrapbook who's still alive. There are 87 families who will be receiving special invitations to tonight's concert, along with a request to share their stories." Margaret's hand flew to her chest. "Mr. Nelson, that's incredible. But how did you manage to do all this so quickly?" Linda Patterson, who had been coordinating logistics all day, stepped forward with a slight smile. "We've actually been planning this for 6 months. Ever since Johnny's lawyer contacted Willie about his final wishes, we've been researching Cedar Ridge, learning about the theater, and preparing for this moment." The revelation that Willie's visit wasn't entirely spontaneous added another layer of meaning to the day's events. Johnny Thompson had orchestrated not just the preservation of the theater, but a celebration of all the love stories it had helped create. "So tonight isn't just about saving the Starlight," David said, understanding dawning in his voice. "It's about honoring everyone who ever fell in love here." Willie picked up his guitar and headed toward the theater's entrance. "That's exactly right, son. And now it's time to show this community just how much their stories matter. The transformation of Cedar Ridge's Main Street into an impromptu concert venue was unlike anything the town had ever experienced. Word of Willie Nelson's performance had spread far beyond the county lines, and cars with license plates from across Texas were parked along streets that normally saw only local traffic. Margaret Morrison stood in the theater's lobby, watching through the windows as her community prepared for something magical. Food trucks had appeared from neighboring towns. Local vendors had set up tables selling everything from handmade crafts to vintage Willie Nelson memorabilia. And the Cedar Ridge Volunteer Fire Department was directing traffic with the efficiency of a major city event management team. "I've never seen anything like this," she said to Willie, who was tuning his guitar and preparing for the performance. "Not in 60 years of living here." Willie smiled, his weathered face creasing with pleasure. "Small towns have a way of surprising you when they come together." Johnny always said that was the magic of places like Cedar Ridge. Everyone's a stranger until something important happens. Then everyone's family. The decision had been made to set up the stage on the street directly in front of the Starlight Cinema, with the theater's Art Deco facade serving as a dramatic backdrop. The marquee, which had announced the theater's closing just that morning, now displayed "Tonight Only, Willie Nelson Live" in letters that blazed against the darkening Texas sky. Linda Patterson had coordinated with local authorities to ensure safety and manage the logistics of what had become a spontaneous festival. Sheriff Tom Bradley and his small force were joined by officers from neighboring jurisdictions, all working to ensure that Cedar Ridge's biggest night in decades went smoothly. "We're estimating about 800 people now," Linda reported to Willie. "The traffic is backing up on Highway 35, and we're getting calls from radio stations in Dallas and Austin wanting to broadcast live." But Willie wasn't concerned about the size of the crowd or the media attention. His focus remained on the promise he had made to Johnny Thompson and the community that had unknowingly shaped one of his dearest friendships. "Before we go out there," Willie said to Margaret and David, "I want you to know that tonight is just the beginning. Tomorrow, we're going to sit down and figure out how to make the Starlight not just survive, but thrive." David had been working with the sound crew to ensure that the acoustics would work for the unusual outdoor setup. Despite his emotional state, his technical expertise was proving invaluable. "Mr. Nelson, I've been thinking about what you said earlier about partnership. What exactly did you have in mind?" Willie set down his guitar and looked around the theater one more time before they headed outside. "I'm thinking about creating a foundation in Johnny and Betty's memory. Something that would not only keep this theater running, but also support live music and community events. Maybe even help other small-town theaters that are struggling." The idea was ambitious beyond anything Margaret had dared to imagine. "A foundation? Mr. Nelson, that's incredibly generous, but it's also a huge undertaking." "I'm 90 years old," Willie replied with a grin. "If I'm going to undertake something huge, I better get started." Sarah Chen had been moving between the theater and the crowd outside, documenting everything for what she knew would be the most important story of her career. "Mrs. Morrison, the people outside are incredible. I've talked to families who drove here from Dallas, couples who had their first dates at the Starlight, former residents who haven't been back to Cedar Ridge in 20 years. This theater means something to so many people." Indeed, the crowd gathering on Main Street represented a cross-section of Texas that surprised even longtime residents. There were elderly couples in lawn chairs, young families with children on their shoulders, teenagers with guitars hoping to catch Willie's attention, and middle-aged folks wearing vintage country music t-shirts that suggested they had been following Willie's career for decades. Emma Rodriguez, who had moved away from Cedar Ridge 15 years ago to pursue a nursing career in Houston, stood with her teenage daughter near the front of the crowd. "This is where your grandfather proposed to your grandmother," she explained to the girl. 1974, during a showing of The Godfather. He said he figured if she could sit through 3 hours of that movie with him, she could sit through anything. Similar stories were being shared throughout the crowd, as people rediscovered the role the Starlight Cinema had played in their personal histories. The theater hadn't just been a place of entertainment, it had been a catalyst for relationships, a keeper of memories, and a cornerstone of community identity. As the sun set completely, the stage lights illuminated Willie Nelson as he walked out to address the crowd. The roar of approval was immediate and overwhelming, a sound that echoed off the buildings of Main Street and seemed to shake the very foundations of the small town. "Good evening, Cedar Ridge," Willie said into the microphone, his voice carrying that distinctive warmth that had made him beloved across multiple generations. "I have to tell you, this is not how I planned to spend my evening, but it's turning out to be one of the most special nights of my life." The crowd quieted, sensing that this was more than just a typical concert introduction. Willie looked directly at the Starlight Cinema's facade, its vintage marquee casting colored light across the gathered faces. 60 years ago, a young songwriter named Johnny Thompson walked into that theater behind me and fell in love. Not just with a beautiful woman named Betty Walsh, but with this community, with this place, and with the idea that music and movies and love could all coexist in one magical space. "Oh!" Willie paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. Many people were already emotional, having heard fragments of the story from neighbors and local reporters, but hearing it directly from Willie gave it a different kind of power. Johnny passed away recently, and before he died, he made me promise to take care of this theater if it ever needed help. Well, friends, it needs help. But tonight, we're not just saving a building. We're saving the place where love stories begin. The applause was thunderous, but Willie raised his hand for quiet. He wasn't finished. "I'm going to tell you something that's going to sound crazy, but I want everyone here to witness it. Tonight, I'm buying every single ticket that the Starlight Cinema would sell for the next 5 years. Every show, every seat, every screening. I'm buying them all." The crowd erupted in confusion and excitement. Margaret gasped audibly from her position near the stage, while David looked stunned. Sarah Chen immediately began texting her editor, knowing that she was witnessing something unprecedented. Willie continued over the noise. "But here's the thing. I'm not keeping those tickets. I'm giving them back to you, to this community. Every person in Cedar Ridge gets free admission to the Starlight Cinema for the next 5 years, compliments of Johnny Thompson's legacy." The emotional impact of Willie's announcement was immediate and overwhelming. People in the crowd were crying, cheering, and embracing strangers. The gesture went far beyond financial support. It was a declaration that the theater belonged to the community it had served for 6 decades. Margaret was helped onto the stage by David and Tom Bradley, her legs shaking with emotion. Willie handed her the microphone, and for a moment she simply stood there, looking out at the hundreds of faces illuminated by the stage lights. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice trembling. "My husband Robert built this theater because he believed that every community deserved something beautiful, something that would bring people together and remind them of their shared humanity. Tonight, Willie Nelson and the memory of Johnny Thompson have given us the greatest gift imaginable, the gift of knowing that our theater will survive." The applause continued for several minutes, but Willie was already transitioning to his guitar, preparing to begin the musical portion of the evening. "I want to start tonight with a song that Johnny Thompson wrote but never let me record. Until now." The opening chords of "The Theater on Main Street" rang out across Cedar Ridge, and Willie began singing Johnny's words about love, community, and the magic of shared experiences. The song had never been performed publicly before, but within minutes, people in the crowd were humming along, instinctively understanding the melody and the sentiment. As Willie played, something extraordinary happened. Local musicians began joining him on stage. First, Sarah's neighbor, Jake Martinez, with his harmonica. Then high school music teacher Rachel Stevens with her violin. Then several teenagers with acoustic guitars. What had begun as a Willie Nelson concert was becoming a community celebration. The set list included Willie's greatest hits, but it also featured songs with connections to small-town life, songs about love and loss, and songs about the importance of preserving the places and traditions that give meaning to our lives. Between songs, Willie shared more stories about Johnny Thompson, about the power of music to connect people across time and distance, and about his belief that every community needed places where magic could happen. During a particularly poignant moment, Willie called Margaret back to the stage. "Mrs. Morrison, Johnny left something else for this theater. Not just money, but a challenge. He wanted the Starlight to become more than just a movie theater. He wanted it to be a place where local musicians could perform, where community events could happen, where the next generation of storytellers could find their voice." Margaret took the microphone again, her confidence growing with each moment in the spotlight. "Then, that's exactly what we'll do. The Starlight Cinema will become the Starlight Cultural Center, a place where movies and music and community all come together, just like they did for Johnny and Betty." The announcement was met with enthusiastic approval from the crowd, many of whom were already imagining the possibilities: local theater productions, music lessons for children, community meetings, wedding receptions, graduation parties, and countless other events that would bring the building back to life. As the concert continued into the night, people began to understand that they weren't just witnessing a performance. They were participating in the rebirth of their community's heart. The Starlight Cinema, which had been dying just 12 hours earlier, was being transformed into something larger and more vital than it had ever been before. Willie closed the official concert with "On the Road Again." But the evening was far from over. Local musicians continued performing impromptu sets. Families spread blankets on Main Street for an impromptu block party, and the Cedar Ridge Diner stayed open late to serve coffee and pie to anyone who needed sustenance for the continuing celebration. But for Willie Nelson, the most important part of the evening was still to come. As the crowd began to thin and the cleanup crews started their work, he made his way back into the Starlight Cinema, carrying Johnny Thompson's notebook and seeking a few moments of quiet reflection. The Starlight Cinema felt different in the early morning hours after the concert. Not empty, but full of potential. Willie Nelson sat alone in seat J7, the same seat where Johnny Thompson had written his songs and hidden his engagement ring more than 50 years earlier. The theater still smelled faintly of popcorn and old velvet, but now it also carried the lingering energy of the hundreds of people who had celebrated its salvation just hours before. Margaret Morrison found him there at sunrise, carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking like someone who had aged backwards overnight. The stress lines that had marked her face for months were gone, replaced by the kind of peaceful exhaustion that comes after witnessing a miracle. "I thought you might still be here," she said, settling into the seat beside Willie. "I couldn't sleep either. Too much to process." Willie accepted the coffee gratefully, his weathered hands wrapping around the warm mug. "I keep thinking about Johnny, wondering if he knew this would happen, if somehow he planned it this way." Through the theater's large windows, they could see Main Street in the gentle morning light. The stage and sound equipment were gone, but the street still bore evidence of the previous night's celebration. Scattered programs, a few forgotten lawn chairs, and the lingering sense that something important had occurred. "Mr. Nelson," Margaret said carefully, "what you did last night? It's going to change everything for Cedar Ridge. But I need to ask you something directly. Are you sure? Are you absolutely certain you want to take on this responsibility?" Willie smiled. the same gentle expression that had characterized his entire career. "Margaret, I'm 90 years old. I've recorded over 100 albums, played thousands of concerts, and met more people than I can count. But I've never had the chance to save a place that mattered to someone I loved. This isn't a responsibility, it's a privilege." David Morrison arrived a few minutes later, looking slightly hungover but radiantly happy. As the theater's projectionist and maintenance supervisor, he had been fielding phone calls since dawn from reporters, town officials, and curious visitors wanting to know more about the Starlight's miraculous salvation. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," David said, settling into the row behind Willie and his mother. "The Austin American-Statesman wants to do a feature story. Texas Monthly is sending a photographer. And we've gotten calls from theater owners in 12 different states asking how we managed to save our building." Willie chuckled. "Fame is a strange thing, son. Yesterday, nobody outside Cedar Ridge knew this theater existed. Today, it's going to be famous across the country. The question is, what are you going to do with that fame?" It was a question that the Morrison family and the community as a whole would need to answer carefully. The attention generated by Willie's gesture was already attracting visitors to Cedar Ridge, and the economic impact could be significant. But they would also need to ensure that the theater remained true to its original purpose as a community gathering place. Sarah Chen joined them, carrying her laptop and looking like someone who had spent the night writing the most important story of her career. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to share the article before I submit it. This story deserves to be told correctly." She read from her screen. In an age when small-town America seems to be disappearing, when streaming services are replacing community theaters, and when economic pressures force families to abandon the businesses that have defined their lives, something extraordinary happened in Cedar Ridge, Texas. A promise made between friends 50 years ago came to fruition in a single magical night, proving that love, music, and community can still triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Willie listened intently as Sarah continued reading, capturing not just the events of the previous evening, but the deeper significance of what had occurred. Her article would introduce Johnny and Betty Thompson's love story to a national audience, but it would also serve as a meditation on the importance of preserving the places where communities gather and memories are made. "There's one more thing," Willie said when Sarah finished reading. "Something I haven't told you yet about Johnny's plans for this place." He pulled out another envelope from his jacket, this one bearing the letterhead of a law firm in Nashville. Johnny didn't just leave money for the theater's operation. He established a trust fund for something he called the Starlight Scholarship. Every year, a graduating senior from Cedar Ridge High School who shows promise in music or storytelling would receive funding to attend college or pursue their artistic dreams. Margaret's hand flew to her chest. He was still thinking about our young people, even after all these years away. "The first recipient has already been chosen," Willie continued. "Marie Garcia, the girl who sang the national anthem at last night's concert. Johnny's lawyer has been watching the local newspaper, looking for young people who reminded him of himself at that age. Marie's been accepted to the Berklee School of Music but couldn't afford to attend. Now she can." The revelation added another layer of meaning to Johnny Thompson's legacy. Not only had he saved the theater where his love story began, but he was also ensuring that future generations would have opportunities to pursue their own artistic dreams. David was shaking his head in amazement. "This is unbelievable." It's like Johnny reached across time to take care of everyone he ever cared about. Linda Patterson, Willie's manager, arrived with a folder full of legal documents and a team of lawyers who had worked through the night to begin the process of establishing the Johnny and Betty Thompson Foundation. The paperwork was complex, but the basic structure was simple. Willie would provide the initial funding, the theater would serve as the foundation's headquarters, and the community would have ongoing input into how the money was used. "We'll need to establish a board of directors," Linda explained to the group. "I'd recommend a mix of community members, arts professionals, and business people who understand nonprofit management." Margaret looked overwhelmed by the complexity of what they were undertaking. "I never ran anything more complicated than a movie theater and concession stand. I don't know if I'm qualified to oversee a foundation." Willie stood up and walked to the theater's stage, looking back at the empty seats that had witnessed decades of shared experiences. "Margaret, you've been running something much more important than a business. You've been running a community institution. You've been preserving a place where people can gather, dream, and fall in love. That's exactly the kind of experience we need leading this foundation." As the morning progressed, more people began arriving at the theater. Town officials wanted to discuss permits and zoning issues. Local business owners were excited about the potential for increased tourism. Former residents who had heard about the previous night's events were making pilgrimages back to their hometown. But perhaps the most meaningful visitor was Betty Rodriguez, Johnny Thompson's great-niece, who had driven overnight from San Antonio after seeing news coverage of the concert. She carried with her a box of Johnny's personal belongings that his family had been unsure what to do with. "Uncle Johnny always talked about this place," Betty said, her eyes filling with tears as she looked around the theater. "He said it was where he learned what love looked like. When I saw the news about what Mr. Nelson did, I knew I had to bring these things here." The box contained photographs of Johnny and Betty Thompson from their early years together, including several taken inside the Starlight Cinema. There were also letters between Johnny and Willie dating back to the 1970s, providing additional context for their friendship and Johnny's deep connection to Cedar Ridge. One photograph in particular caught Willie's attention. It showed Johnny and Betty at their wedding reception, which had been held in the theater's lobby in 1971. Betty was wearing a simple white dress and holding a bouquet of wildflowers, while Johnny wore his best suit and the kind of smile that suggested he couldn't believe his good fortune. "They look so young and happy," Margaret said, studying the photograph. "I remember that reception. We rolled back the lobby carpet and had dancing until midnight. It was one of the most joyful nights this theater ever hosted." Willie carefully examined each item in the box, treating them with the reverence due to precious relics. But it was a small cassette tape labeled "For the Starlight" that captured his attention most completely. "Do you still have a cassette player?" he asked David, who nodded and disappeared into the projection booth. He returned with an old boombox that had been used for background music during intermissions. The tape contained Johnny's voice, recorded sometime in the months before his death, speaking directly to the theater and the community that had shaped his life. "If you're hearing this, then Willie kept his promise, and the Starlight is going to survive. I want everyone in Cedar Ridge to know that this theater gave me everything that mattered in my life. It gave me Betty. It gave me a place to write music. And it gave me an understanding of what community really means. But more than that, it taught me that love isn't just something that happens between two people. Love is something that happens between a person and a place, between neighbors and strangers, between the past and the future. The Starlight Cinema is a place where all kinds of love can flourish. I hope that 50 years from now, another young songwriter will sit in the back row and write songs about the person they're falling in love with. I hope that children will still experience the magic of movies on a big screen. I hope that when people need to gather together for celebrations or grief, for music or silence, they'll still have this place to come home to. Thank you, Cedar Ridge. Thank you, Margaret and Robert Morrison. Thank you, Willie Nelson. And thank you, Starlight Cinema, for showing me that every love story needs a perfect setting. The recording left everyone in tears, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. Johnny Thompson's voice, preserved in technology that was already becoming obsolete, served as a bridge between the theater's past and its future. As Willie prepared to leave Cedar Ridge later that morning, he stood once more in the theater's lobby, surrounded by the people who would carry forward Johnny's vision. Margaret and David Morrison would continue operating the theater. But now, with the security of knowing they could focus on programming and community service rather than survival. Sarah Chen would document the theater's transformation as it became a model for other small-town cultural preservation efforts. And the entire community of Cedar Ridge would benefit from having a gathering place that was guaranteed to remain open for generations to come. Johnny would be proud, Willie said, taking one last look around the space that had been transformed overnight from a failing business into a symbol of hope. Margaret embraced him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Nelson, how can we ever thank you for what you've done?" Willie smiled and picked up his guitar case. "Just keep the magic alive, Margaret. Keep showing movies. Keep hosting concerts. Keep bringing people together. That's all the thanks Johnny would want. And it's all the thanks I need." As Willie's bus pulled away from Cedar Ridge, the Starlight Cinema's marquee displayed a new message. Now showing the future. Admission free for all Cedar Ridge residents. It was a promise that would be kept for years to come, a testament to the power of friendship, the importance of community, and the enduring magic of places where love stories begin. The theater that had been scheduled to close forever was now guaranteed to remain open, not just as a movie house, but as a cultural center that would serve Cedar Ridge for generations to come. Johnny Thompson's promise to preserve the place where his love story began had been kept, and in the process, it had become the beginning of countless new stories yet to be told. In the months that followed, the Starlight Cultural Center would indeed become a model for small-town revitalization, attracting visitors from across the country and inspiring similar preservation efforts in dozens of other communities. But for the people of Cedar Ridge, the most important thing was much simpler. They had kept their gathering place, their community heart, and their connection to the love stories that had shaped their town for over 60 years. And on Friday nights, when the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, moviegoers in seat J7 could sometimes swear they heard the faint sound of someone humming along to the music, as if Johnny Thompson had finally found his way home.